Hey everybody, welcome back to our series on Philippians. In this series, we've been looking at the letter called Philippians. It's in the New Testament, and it's a letter that Paul wrote to the church at Philippi. This was a church that he had pastored and planted and pastored, and a church that we can tell that he loved a lot.
Yes.
He said a lot of really kind things to them. He said a lot of really encouraging things to them, which is especially telling since he was writing to them from being in jail. He was being put in prison for his work of trying to spread the good news about who Jesus was. And here he sits down and pens this really awesome letter encouraging other people to not give up and to do a good job. What we talked about last week was how to live as a citizen of heaven.
Sure.
That was kind of the call that Paul gave us. And what we're going to talk about tonight in chapter 2 is a continuation of that discussion, where he gives us some examples of how to be citizens of heaven. And the main words we're going to focus on is the words obedience and the words humility.
Humility.
You know anything about humility?
I know a song about humility.
You gonna sing it?
Well, I could, but I probably shouldn't.
No, I think you should. Go ahead.
Well, it's just, Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I think they wrote that song about me.
That's
actually.
your theme song?
Yeah.
I kind of think if you say you're humble, you're probably not.
Might
humble.
be. True.
That's kind of the way it works.
Might be true. I don't know.
You got any other quotes about humility?
I actually do have a serious quote that I shared on Sunday, and I think for me, this kind of really does encompass sort of, at least from a practical standpoint, how we approach humility. And it was from C.S. Lewis, who said that humility is not necessarily thinking less of yourself, but rather thinking of yourself less. So again, not necessarily looking at yourself as anything less than a child of God, created by God, loved by God, and certainly, made on purpose and for a purpose, but rather that, the world doesn't revolve around you, that it is, that there's far more important things happening around than just your own fame, glory, and pleasure.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I wonder if we might, it's not looking at your own self and being like, I'm an idiot, I'm so terrible.
Yeah.
It's not that. Humility is not that. It's looking at somebody else and saying, that person is doing a really awesome job. How can I help them? Or how can I bring them to a place where they can do an awesome job? It's just looking outside of yourself.
Yeah, and I think even too, when it comes to we get caught up a lot in what's in it for me. And so thinking about the greater good, like what is, whatever decision I'm going to make, what attitude I bring to the table, like how does this affect everyone else? Thinking of others, above or at least on an equal level to yourself, when most of the time we walk into a circumstance or a situation and we can only look through our own lens and we're just looking out for number one. When it comes to humility, we've got to think of others.
That's the call that Paul gives us in chapter 2. He says, is there any encouragement from belonging to Christ, any comfort from his love, any fellowship together in the Spirit? Are your hearts tender and compassionate? Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, and working together with one-minded purpose. And then he gives us the how. He says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. And then he goes on to give us an example of somebody who was truly humble, and that example was Jesus.
Certainly. Yeah, so Paul gives us the example of Jesus, and he says in this letter that he's writing, he says, you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Or some translations might say, you must have the same mindset as Jesus, or have the same mind as Christ. And so he says, if we're going to work toward these things that he's just described about, don't be selfish, don't look out for your own good, he says, if you would just adopt the attitude of Jesus, you could work that out. It would kind of play itself out. And so to give us an example, he uses this song or poem, we assume, probably something that was familiar to the people that he's writing to, and may have been something he had sang with them. Who knows? Yeah. But more than likely, this is a familiar set of lines. And he says, though he was God, speaking of Jesus, of course, though he was God, did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Another translation might read, though he was God, he did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped or to leverage. And I think for us, when we think about humility and what it means to live humbly, you know, we have to consider, like, in what ways in our life do we attempt to leverage our status? Do we look at someone, number one, and think, well, I'm better than her or I'm better than him? You know, we're trying to size ourselves up, and then we go in and try to use that as some way to get what we want. And I don't know about you, but I've been in situations where I've seen people, you know, ask the question, like, do you know who I am? Yeah. Like, and I probably have in my own life at times been so arrogant as to say, you know, well, I should get this because I am whatever. And so, so with this being said, like, humility practiced, if it's going to look like Jesus, it's going to mean that we lay down our privileges. In fact, Paul goes on to say, instead of thinking of equality with God as something to hang on to, instead, Jesus gave up his divine privileges. In other words, he took all of, you know, the privileges of being God, and I see that as oftentimes like his power, not so much that he lays that down and could never pick it back up, but chooses willingly to take on the position of a human, number one, and we read that further in this letter, in this song. He says, you know, he took the humble position of a slave. And that he was born as a human being. That in and of itself shows the humility of Christ, who has existed for all time. And so he chose willingly to limit himself by putting on flesh, and so that he might live with those he was seeking to rescue, and also not to leverage this idea that he was God, even though knowing in the long run that this sort of trip downward, this limitation, this humility would ultimately lead to the rescue and salvation of his people, but also to the exaltation of Christ, of himself, that God would lift him high and he would reign and rule once again.
In this poem, Paul talks about how Jesus set aside his divine power, his equality with God. He set all that aside. He came, was born in human likeness. He put himself in the position of a slave or a servant. Mm-hmm. And I've heard this idea talked about as a descent, that Jesus descended from heaven, from his position of being one with God, and came to earth as a human and gave all that up. And so he like willingly put himself in a lower position. Not for the sake of being elevated, but for the sake of saving us. And then the ending that he gets elevated is a result of all that, but that's not the why of why he did that. But I think that's an important example for us to follow, is that sometimes we have to think about ways that we would willingly descend, or we would put ourselves in a lower position for the sake of somebody else.
And I think that's what's super critical about this and understanding it, and why Paul's asking them to imitate Christ, or to, you know, have the same attitude as Jesus, because when you think about it in a way, ultimately, like, Jesus comes down to rescue us, to gather us, and ultimately, as we read in the Gospel according to John, to take us back with him, to take us to himself. And so I think for many of us, we know what it's like to live in the valley, to be, you know, to be in sin or to be in darkness. Like, we know what that looks like, and we can remember it, but sometimes I think we forget that, you know, though we've experienced the grace of Jesus ourselves, like, we still have a life to live that oftentimes descends into the valley, with the hope of gathering as many as possible and helping them to see Jesus as well. And so I think humility is a key ingredient to following Jesus, to being a disciple. Like, I think Paul would say it's incredibly important. And I think, you know, I don't know about you, but for me, that's a difficult thing, and it's not natural to practice humility. The natural thing is to look out for number one, and to do whatever I can do for me in making me to become like Jesus. We have to practice humility.
After Paul writes down this poem for the Philippians to read, with the example of who Jesus is and how Jesus is the best ultimate example of what it means to live a life of humility, he goes on with a few more commands to them, or I don't know, it's not commands, but just like some charges. Like, here's some
Sure.
other things that I want you to do. Some more instructions, I guess is the right way.
Sure.
One of them, one of my favorite verses to use with my children is do everything without complaining or arguing.
Yes.
Maybe I grabbed that out of context a little bit, but I feel like it's a good line that in the Bible we're to do everything without complaining and arguing. But the reason is that so no one can criticize you,
Sure.
and that you can. And this translation says, live clean, innocent lives as children of God's, shining like bright lights in a world full of crooked and perverse people.
Sure.
Growing up, I learned this verse is we're going to shine like stars in a crooked and depraved generation.
Yeah.
And certainly if you think about the night sky and how dark it is, and then there's these little pockets of light that we can see from millions and millions of miles away, if you think about it as stars, like that's what Paul's calling us to do this whole chapter long, is we live in a crooked and perverse generation. What was the way that he said it here? Yeah, crooked and perverse people. We live among that, and so we're supposed to be little bits of light that shine out and show people who Jesus is when they look at us.
Sure.
He closes out this next little chapter that we've got by giving the Philippians examples of two people that they had actually knew who are living this kind of life. The first one, he gives them the example of Timothy. He was kind of like his sidekick along the way, and says, I'm going to send Timothy to you. And Timothy's an awesome guy because it says in verse 20, he genuinely cares about your welfare. I think that's Paul saying, hey, Timothy cares more. He's looking to your interests more than his own.
Sure.
So it's an example. And the next one is a guy, I don't really know how to say his name correctly, Epaphroditus.
Yeah.
And this is a guy from the church at Philippi that they sent to Paul.
With
And
the gift.
they sent a gift along with him
Sure.
and said, hey, go take this gift and this message to Paul and tell him we're thinking about him while he's in prison.
Sure.
And Paul says, hey, this guy risks his own life when he comes to see me because
Certainly.
the guy gets sick while he's there
Yeah.
and almost dies. And so Paul lifts him up as like, this is somebody who put his own life on the line to come visit me.
Yeah.
Those two examples of people would be familiar to the Philippians. Like they could look and say, oh, we know those guys. That's what Paul's calling us to do. We can do that maybe.
Yeah.
So as we close out tonight, we want you to think about in your group, what does this mean to live a life of humility?
Sure.
And in a way that is obedient to who Jesus is, that follows his own example. You can take a look at the rest of the passage that we didn't read, the rest of this chapter that we didn't read, and then with your group talk about examples, real practical ways of ways that you can live a life of humility, that you might be a light in a dark world.
Absolutely, because it really is a dark world, and I don't want to, scream gloom and doom, but at the same time, like if we really would take serious having the attitude of Christ, that if our lives truly reflected a life filled with humility and obedience to Jesus, the world can't help but be changed and transformed by that, and I think so desperately wants and needs our light to shine in those dark places. So I hope you'll have some fruitful discussion. Most of all, I hope when you go back home and go back to work and go back to your day-to-day, that you really would be light shining in the dark. It's a privilege. It's a great responsibility. God bless you, and we'll see you on Sunday.